Editor here. If you haven't seen part 1, you might want to go check that out first. So as I stated earlier, the start of my Linux journey began with Ubuntu 20.04. And as you just saw, I'm on Arch Linux now. So how did I end up on Arch Linux, and why didn't I just stick with Ubuntu or any other distro in between, really? So with Ubuntu 20.04 is when I started pushing snaps. And for some reason, I do not know how this happened, snaps completely broke my system. So I initiated updates, I started the updater, and when it was updating, it kind of froze on updating snaps and it wouldn't stop. It didn't know what happened. So I let it sit there. After about 24 hours, it figured itself out. But then when I went and I updated again later, I was spitting out errors. Like, it just wouldn't update properly. And I didn't know what it did or why it was broken suddenly. So I ran some terminal commands that I found. So while it fixed the immediate problem and everything was back to normal, the problem kept reoccurring. So since I was already having trouble with snaps and I was already making use of Flatpaks anyway in some cases for certain apps, I decided to move on to Pop! OS. And at the time, I basically viewed it as Ubuntu, but with Flatpaks instead of snaps, which was perfect for me because I didn't like snaps in the first place and I basically avoided them at all costs. I was already using Flatpaks, so I basically cloned my Ubuntu system to a new partition on a different drive. Then I wiped my current drive and I moved to Pop! OS. And I used Pop! OS all the way up until I think about 5 months ago, actually. This is where things get a little complicated because the reason I moved off of Pop! OS wasn't System 76's fault. Pop! OS was a great system and it was good, but there were just issues around Pop! OS that were largely out of their control. So the first issue I had was actually with GNOME. GNOME wouldn't sleep properly, and every time, so like when I locked the computer and GNOME went to sleep and the computer went to sleep, it wouldn't wake back up. It just never would. So I disabled sleep. I added an extension to disable it. A few months before I moved to Arch Linux, that extension spontaneously stopped working. So I forgot what I did. Oh yeah, I completely had to disable locking. So I was unable to lock my computer because every time I locked it and it went to sleep, it would never wake back up. So locking was completely disabled for a few months. And then another issue arose. And again, this wasn't the fault of System 76, but my entire system started lagging. And initially I thought it was like a kernel issue or maybe some weird package. So I thought it would sort itself out over time, and it didn't. And in fact, I think I have some I have some footage of this too I'll bring up. Pay close attention to this cat right here. So I'm going to click. And as you can see, the cat just suddenly starts moving at a super low frame rate. You can literally count it at that point until he eventually just is freeze framing now. And as you can see, the frames got progressively worse. And that's what, and keep in mind, due to my aspect ratios, I'm currently using a Samsung Odyssey G9. I'm not actually able to record full screen or so. This isn't in game. So this is the whole desktop that's lagging. It's not like a single game or just like in this instance. It's the entire desktop. I'm also going to pull something else up in relation to this. So that's basically why I moved off of Pop! OS. I was trying to troubleshoot what happened. So I did a clean OS install to Arch Linux. The reason I moved to Arch Linux as a troubleshooting step is for two reasons. One, I was hoping there was already a fix available in the kernel because I thought it was a kernel issue. And two, Arch Linux would get those fixes faster if it was an issue. So that's what my thought process was with moving to Arch. But there were a couple things I'm going to show real quick. This is what was happening while the computer was dying, and I don't know exactly what was going on except frames were dropping and the kernel was throwing tons of errors. Basically, I believe I looked this up and this was a USB error if I remember correctly. So yeah, this is a USB interface, a USB host controller. So basically it was throwing a ton of errors related to USB in the kernel and I didn't know what was happening. So this right here shows you that this wasn't something that I created in Blender or modified the video to do. This wasn't something where I was stepping the video frames. The mouse right here is sitting here screaming, "Holy crap, the system is dying, help, please!" Like, are you freaking kidding me? Why is my mouse screaming? So as I said, I thought this was like a weird kernel issue, so I jumped over to Arch Linux and hoped that it was something that would be fixed in a newer update. And here's the weird thing. Arch Linux didn't even solve my problem. I was experiencing the same issues on Arch Linux, and I was really confused as to why. So I thought it'll just work itself out eventually, but that wasn't the case. I found what the problem was. And so what was really causing my problems wasn't actually the kernel, and it wasn't actually Linux itself. It was a completely separate thing. And you really want to know what it was? Fucking Nvidia. Again. Like, this wasn't the first Nvidia... Like, I ripped the Nvidia GPU out for a completely separate reason, which was Minecraft at the time, which I was trying to record, it wasn't grabbing my display card. It was using the Nvidia card and passing the video through to the RX 7800 XT. So I went to the Arch Wiki and looked up a command to tell the system to use the RX 7800 XT instead of the Nvidia 2060 KO. And it didn't work. It just flat out refused and continued using the 2060. So at that point I was mad and I ripped the Nvidia GPU out of my system because since I was planning on deprecating CUDA anyway, I just decided it's time to move on from Nvidia. I want my things to work the way they're intended. I want to see you try to use the 2060 if it's not in the system. So I did that and I rebooted, and guess what happened? This error disappeared. This error was not caused by a USB or a USB issue. This wasn't a kernel issue. The Nvidia GPU or the Nvidia driver was causing the issue. This wasn't an issue where I turned on my system and it's like, oh, it's immediately laggy. I don't even think this was a hardware issue. I think this was an Nvidia driver issue. This wouldn't be the first Nvidia driver issue I had on Linux. And I'm actually going to pull another one up that I had in regards to Minecraft specifically this time. So this right here is the issue that caused me to actually buy my 7800 XT in the first place. Because I wanted to play games without having to type a command to actually get it to work properly. So this is what you would see if you were firing up a version of Minecraft that was 1.12.2 or older. And as you can see, this is not a very good experience. And it was reported and added as a bug on June 23rd of 2023. And I want to point something out, that this wasn't just with the open driver, this happened on the proprietary driver as well. This was an issue overall with the Nvidia driver. And here, this is what prompted me. I decided to wait 2 weeks to see if they'd fix the issue. Give a chance to see if the issue would have been fixed. It took 6 months. That is insane to me. A game-related bug in a GPU driver should not take 6 months to fix. Like, I understand, GPU drivers are complex and they're hard to manage, but this is a first-party driver by Nvidia. It's supposed to be game-ready, and it was affecting not just, and this was an issue that was not just affecting this open driver, which back then, from what I understood, was like a beta state type thing, but it was affecting their proprietary driver as well. This arguably should not have been happening in the first place. And it was an issue that I didn't experience on my AMD card. So I've just been an AMD user ever since, and when my system started freezing from this other Nvidia issue here, I completely ripped the GPU out of my system. Like, if it can't run my system, I don't want you in it. Why in the hell was the Nvidia driver so bad that it was literally freezing the system? And I'm also going to be perfectly honest, moving to Arch wasn't also just a troubleshooting step. I was also interested in having access to the AUR at the time as well. But since I was already on Linux, it wasn't really a dire circumstance until my system started freezing. And I did it as not only as a troubleshooting step, but because I was interested in the AUR. But the fact that the Nvidia driver was so bad that it was freezing the system. I still don't think it was the card. I never had an issue with the card, and the issue wasn't right when I booted my system, as I said. It was something that crept up slowly over time, almost like an exponential curve of sorts, where like if you push it along the x-axis far enough, it'll start out slow, but then it'll quickly ramp up and get worse. And you kind of saw that in that video there, where it was like slowly freezing and then suddenly the frame started chugging. And when it comes to Nvidia on Linux, this isn't the end of the story. In fact, if you're an Nvidia user, not only may you experience driver issues with the proprietary and the open driver, but you also got to decide which driver you want to use. The recommendation apparently is if you're on the 2000 or 3000 series, use the Nvidia open drivers. If you're on the 4000 series or Maxwell, or I believe this would include the 5000 series as well, use the Nvidia proprietary driver. But another driver you have to be aware of is NVK. So this is a third driver that's been in the works for a while. NVK. This is for 20 series and newer and is incorporated into the Mesa project. Now, why would you use NVK over the Nvidia Open or the Nvidia proprietary? Well, there's a good reason for this. And that's because just about every Linux distribution ships Mesa in some way. Everything from Debian all the way up to Arch Linux. This is where Nvidia is an outlier, right? Because in the Mesa project, you have AMD and Intel engineers working on their respective GPU drivers, but NVK is completely being constructed by the community to bring Nvidia support into the Mesa project and provide a video driver that is coherent to the Mesa standards. To my knowledge, there aren't any Nvidia engineers actively working on NVK. Nvidia is only shipping their open and their proprietary solutions, and they're kind of just going in their own way. What this means is if you have an AMD or an Intel card, the drivers in the Mesa project, which are shipped by default in a lot of distributions, are already there. Your AMD or Intel GPU is basically plug and play with your system. Meanwhile, if you're on Nvidia, you gotta decide whether you're gonna use the open and proprietary or the community managed NVK. And this driver fragmentation has me a little curious on how Steve from Gamers Nexus is going to test Nvidia GPUs on the Linux side. Because you got basically 3 different drivers, each of which could perform slightly differently. I mean, the open driver probably doesn't perform that much different from the proprietary driver, but then the open driver doesn't support Maxwell, and it apparently is not recommended for the 4000 series or newer. So maybe you just use the proprietary driver in that case. But if it's eventually going to be phased out for NVK because Mesa is shipping by default in a lot of these projects, you basically have 3 different drivers, not counting the legacy driver for older cards, 4, to run Nvidia GPUs. Basically, Nvidia is a complete mess on the Linux side. So I'm going to end this video by saying Linux itself isn't really that hard to use as long as you're not doing stupid things or trying to do some temporary ghetto solution. But another thing you should be wary of when moving to Linux is if your system utilizes Nvidia. Nvidia's been constantly a mess, apparently on the Windows side too. At this point, just don't use Nvidia, regardless of whether you're on Windows or Linux, because they're a mess on both platforms. You're having driver issues on the Windows side, but you're not safe on the Linux side either. Just use AMD cards at this point. It's not really even a Linux issue.